He wasn't supposed to be home yet. Everything was quiet, too quiet. But the moment the Mafia boss stepped inside, his maid rushed toward him, her eyes wide with fear, and whispered just 2 words. "Stay silent." No explanation. No time to think. Just pure urgency. And as the tension in the room thickened, he realized something was terribly wrong, and whatever was hiding inside his home was already watching. For a man who controlled fear for a living, nothing inside his own home had ever unsettled him. He was the one people whispered about, the one who walked into danger without hesitation. But that night was different. He had returned earlier than planned. No guards, no warning, just instinct pulling him back. At first, everything seemed normal. The lights were on. The air was still. Too still. Then she appeared, his maid. Usually quiet, almost invisible, but now, completely shaken. Her hands trembled, her breathing uneven, her eyes locked onto his with a kind of fear he had never seen before. And then she said it. "Stay silent." No explanation. No context. Just a warning that made no sense until he listened closely. Because beneath the silence of his home, something didn't belong. And in that moment, for the first time in years, the man everyone feared realized he might not be the most dangerous presence in the room. The city hummed with a deceptive peace 30 floors below, a carpet of electric amber and cold neon that usually signaled Drajan Valter's total dominion. But tonight, as the private elevator slowed to a jagged, grinding halt 10 floors short of the penthouse, the silence in the mahogany car tasted like copper. Drajan's jaw tightened, his sharp profile reflected in the polished brass. He checked his gold watch, 12:04 a.m. He wasn't supposed to be back from the docks for another 3 hours, but a gut feeling, the kind that had kept him alive through 2 decades of street wars and corporate assassinations, had pulled him back early. The elevator doors groaned open halfway, revealing a dark, unfinished maintenance floor. The air was thick with the scent of drywall and stale grease. Drajan stepped out, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the Beretta tucked into the small of his back, his tailored black suit a shadow within a shadow. He didn't use the stairs. He moved toward the emergency service lift, his slicked back hair catching a stray glint of moonlight. He reached the summit of his empire, the glass-encased foyer of his private residence, expecting the soft chime of the security recognition system. Instead, he found the digital terminal dead. Black, a void where his control used to be. A floorboard creaked, a sound that shouldn't exist in a world of reinforced steel and soundproof glass. Drajan spun, his fist clenching, the muscles in his neck straining against his collar, the ink of his tattoos appearing like bruised veins in the gloom. He was ready to break whoever stood in his way, but the figure that emerged from the dark wasn't a hitman. It was Lyanna. The maid, a woman he had barely looked at in 3 years, was pressed against the cold marble wall of the vestibule. Her neat black and white uniform was wrinkled, and her wide eyes reflected a panic that made Drajan's blood turn to ice. Before he could speak, before his low, lethal voice could demand an explanation, she lunged forward. She didn't attack. She grabbed his lapel with trembling fingers and pressed her other hand firmly over his mouth. The audacity of the gesture nearly made him recoil, but the sheer, raw terror in her gaze anchored him. "Don't make a sound," she hissed, her breath hitching in her throat. Her voice was a frayed thread, barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation. "If she hears you, the boy dies before you reach the door. Your life is already forfeit, Drajan. They think you're at the docks. They've already scrubbed you from the system." Drajan froze. The "they" she referred to felt like a physical weight. He looked at the hand covering his mouth, small, calloused from work, and shaking, then back at her. For the first time, he saw her not as a servant, but as a sentinel. "The elevators didn't malfunction," she whispered, leaning closer, her eyes darting toward the ornate double doors of the nursery. Varel cut the lines. "Your security team? They aren't yours anymore. They're standing outside the stairwell waiting for the signal that the accident at the docks was a success. You're a ghost in your own house." Drajan's heart hammered a heavy, rhythmic war drum against his ribs. He wanted to scream, to draw his weapon and storm the room where Kale was kept, but Lyanna's grip tightened on his jacket, pulling him deeper into the velvet shadows behind a heavy decorative curtain. "Look," she breathed, pointing a single, trembling finger toward the sliver of light beneath the nursery door. In the silence of the darkened foyer, Drajan heard it, the cold, rhythmic tapping of a high heel against the hardwood floor inside, and then a voice that sounded like silk wrapped around a blade. It was Varel, and she wasn't talking to a child, she was talking to a victim. Drajan sank into the darkness, the sovereign of the city suddenly reduced to a voyeur in his own sanctuary, realizing that the woman holding his mouth shut was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. The shadows of the service corridor felt like a tomb, but Lyanna moved through them with a frantic, practiced grace. She led Drajan toward a narrow maintenance panel concealed behind a heavy tapestry, her fingers flying over a manual override he hadn't known existed. The panel slid back to reveal a cramped observation gallery, a relic of the building's original design for high-stakes security. Before them lay a pane of two-way glass, overlooking the bright, artificial cheer of the nursery. Drajan pressed his forehead against the cold surface, his breath hitching as he looked down into the room. It was a scene of clinical cruelty. The warm golden light from the designer lamps usually gave the playroom a sanctuary-like glow, but tonight, it felt like the harsh glare of a laboratory. In the center of the patterned rug, young Kale was on his knees, his small frame trembling so violently it was visible even from the gallery. Varel Sorn stood over him, a towering pillar of aggressive crimson. She had shed the soft, silk robe she usually wore to greet Drajan. In its place was a sharp, military-cut suit the color of fresh arterial blood. Her posture was no longer that of the supportive fiancée, the woman who had promised to help Drajan raise his ward. She leaned forward, her finger pointed like a bayonet at the boy's chest. Again, Varel's voice cut through the hidden speakers in the gallery, stripped of its melodic charm. It was cold, metallic, and devoid of soul. Recite the sequence, Kale. The rhyme your mother sang. Every syllable, or we start the frequency again. Kale's head was lowered, his eyes fixed on a scattered pile of wooden blocks. I can't remember, he whispered, his voice cracking. Please, Auntie Varel, my ears hurt. Varel didn't offer a hug or a comforting word. Instead, she let out a dry, jagged laugh that made Drajan's fist crack against the interior wall. I am not your aunt, you pathetic little glitch. You are a biological vault, and I am the locksmith. Your mother was a fool to think she could hide the encryption in a lullaby and give you to a monster like Drajan for safekeeping. Drajan watched, paralyzed by a cocktail of guilt and burgeoning fury. He had brought this woman into his inner sanctum. He had kissed the lips that were now snarling at a defenseless child. He saw Varel reach into her pocket and pull out a sleek, black device, a localized ultrasonic emitter. She clicked a button, and although the sound was inaudible to Drajan, he watched Kale collapse, clutching his ears, and let out a silent, agonized scream. Drajan thinks he owns this city, Varel mocked, pacing around the suffering boy like a shark. He thinks he's a king because he has blood on his hands. But power isn't in the streets anymore, Kale. It's in the code. Once I have that rhyme, once I unlock the Sorn Syndicate's ghost protocol, Drajan Valtor won't just be dead. He'll be erased. His bank accounts, his property deeds, his very identity. I'll delete him with a keystroke while he's still gasping for air. She stopped pacing and grabbed Kale by the chin, forcing his tear-streaked face upward. The mask of the loving socialite was gone, replaced by the hollow, predatory hunger of a corporate saboteur. You're going to give me that key, Kale? And then, I'm going to tuck you in for the very last time. Beside Drajan, Lyanna's hand found his arm again, her grip a silent plea for restraint. He could feel the heat radiating off his own skin, his heart pounding a lethal rhythm. The woman in red was no longer his partner. She was a virus that had infected his home, and the child on the floor was the only thing keeping his world from vanishing into a digital abyss. The crimson shadow had finally revealed its true shape, and Drajan realized that the war wasn't at the docks. It was 6 inches away, behind a sheet of glass. Drajan's breath fogged the glass, a frantic heat rising from his lungs as he watched Varel tower over the suffering child. He reached for the heavy brass handle of the observation door, his knuckles white, his intent to kill as sharp as the ink on his skin. But Lyanna's hand clamped onto his wrist with a strength that defied her slight frame, pulling him back into the stifling darkness of the corridor. If you go in there now, She hits the kill switch on the penthouse servers, Lina whispered, her voice a jagged rasp against his ear. And you lose more than just your life. You lose the only reason Kale is still breathing. Drajan turned on her, his eyes wild, his jaw set in a lethal snarl. She's torturing a child in my house, Lina. My ward. I don't give a damn about my servers. He isn't just your ward, Drajan, she countered, her gaze boring into his with a terrifying clarity. She reached into the hidden pocket of her apron and pulled out a slim, encrypted tablet, its screen glowing with a soft, ominous blue. You thought you were doing a favor for a dying associate when you took him in. You thought he was an orphan of the streets. But look at the biometric scans I've spent months intercepting. Drajan looked down. The screen displayed a complex double helix mapped against a series of binary strings. It wasn't just DNA, it was a cryptographic architecture. Kale is the biological repository for the Aegis 7 protocol, Lina explained, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through lines of code that looked like ancient poetry. His mother wasn't just a victim of a gang war. She was the lead architect for the Sorn Syndicate's rival. She didn't leave him to you for protection, Drajan. She encoded the master key to the city's entire digital infrastructure, the power grids, the banking ledgers, the private satellite arrays, into his very blood. It's a digital doomsday device. Drajan felt the world tilt. The muscular, tattooed sovereign of Chicago's underworld suddenly felt like a pawn in a game he hadn't even known was being played. A blood code. Varel doesn't want to marry you for your empire, Lina hissed, pointing back toward the glass where the woman in red was now holding a scanner to Kale's temple. She's using you as a shield while she tries to extract that rhyme from his subconscious. That nursery rhyme is the vocal trigger that aligns with his unique neural frequency to unlock the protocol. Once she has it, she initiates the Ghost Protocol. She wipes the Sorn Syndicate's enemies, starting with you, and takes absolute control of every electronic heartbeat in this city. Drajan watched Kale through the glass, the boy's small face twisted in a silent plea for a mother who had unknowingly turned him into a weapon. The toys and the colorful playhouse in the background looked like a cruel joke, a bright cage for a child carrying a burden that could level civilizations. She's been harvesting his data for 3 months, Lina continued, her voice heavy with the weight of her secret watch. Every time you were away at the docks, every time you were handling business, she was in here, breaking him down, trying to find the sequence. If she activates it, Kale's mind won't survive the neural surge. He's not just a key, Drajan. He's the fuse. Drajan looked at his gold watch, then at his clenched fist. He had spent his life building a kingdom of stone and blood, never realizing that the most powerful weapon on earth was kneeling on a patterned rug in his nursery, being interrogated by the woman he had invited into his bed. The fury in his chest was no longer just about betrayal. It was a cold, calculating resolve. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man standing between a monster and a boy who was never supposed to be a target. How much time? Drajan asked, his voice dropping to a frequency that vibrated in the very floorboards. She's close, Lina replied, her eyes fixed on the tablet. The sequence is nearly complete. We have until the next sunrise before the upload is irreversible. The hum of the high-rise ventilation system felt like a predatory breath against Drajan's neck as he remained anchored in the shadows of the observation gallery. Through the two-way glass, the nursery had transformed into a theater of cold, calculated cruelty. Varel moved with a practiced, predatory elegance, crossing to a small white table where a silver tray sat. On it, a delicate porcelain teapot released a thin, curling wisp of steam that looked like a ghost in the harsh LED light. You're tired, Kale, Varel said, her voice dropping into a honeyed cadence that made Drajan's skin crawl. It was the tone she used when she wanted to manipulate him, a soft, velvet lure that hit a jagged hook. Your mind is fighting me because you're exhausted. Drink this. It will help the memories flow. It will help the song come back. She poured a dark, amber liquid into a cup. Even from behind the glass, Drajan could see the faint, oily sheen on the surface of the tea. It wasn't just a sedative. It was a neuroinhibitor, a chemical crowbar designed to pry open the locked doors of the boy's subconscious. Kale looked at the cup with a hollow, wide-eyed stare. I'm not thirsty, Auntie Varel. It smells like metal. Varel's hand paused, her grip on the porcelain tightening until her knuckles turned a stark, bone white. The facade of the loving guardian flickered, revealing the serrated edge of her true nature. "Drink it, Kale. Unless you want the noise to come back." She reached out, her fingers grazing the ultrasonic emitter sitting on the table. Drajan's hand flew to his beretta, the metal cold and reassuring against his palm. He took a step toward the heavy door that separated the gallery from the hallway, but a sudden movement in the corridor beyond caught his eye. Visible through the narrow observation slit in the gallery door were two men standing guard at the nursery entrance. They were wearing the charcoal gray suits of Drajan's own elite security detail. Men he had handpicked, men whose families he had supported, men who had sworn blood oaths to his sovereign protection. Marco and Elias. Marco, a man Drajan had once pulled from the wreckage of a burning car, stood perfectly still, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. He wasn't looking for intruders. He was watching the hallway with a cold, professional detachment, ensuring that no one, not even the master of the house, could interrupt the interrogation. Elias checked his watch, then nodded toward the nursery door. "The boss is late from the docks," he muttered, his voice carrying through the vents. "If she doesn't get that code in the next 10 minutes, the Sorn extraction team is going to move in regardless. Tell her to skip the tea and just use the needle." The realization hit Drajan harder than a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just a domestic infiltration, it was a total systemic collapse. His fortress had been gutted from the inside out. Every camera he relied on, every sensor he trusted, and every man he called brother was now a weapon aimed at his back. He wasn't just watching his fiancée torture his ward. He was watching the funeral of his own empire. In the nursery, Varel forced the cup against Kale's lips. The boy whimpered, a small, broken sound that echoed in the tiny gallery, vibrating in Drajan's chest. "Don't," Lyanna whispered beside him, her hand pressing firmly against the small of his back as he lurched forward. "Look at the hallway cameras on the tablet. They have heat signatures positioned at every exit. If you move now, they'll flood the room with gas. They want you dead, Drajan, but they need him conscious. If you trigger the alarm, they'll kill you and take the boy to a black site where you'll never find him." Drajan watched Kale take a small, forced sip of the poisoned tea, the boy's eyes fluttering as the drug began to cloud his vision. The rage in Drajan's soul transitioned from a wildfire to a cold, pressurized ice. He looked at the guards who had betrayed him, then at the woman who had poisoned his life. He was no longer the man who returned to his penthouse expecting peace. He was a ghost in the machine, and as he watched Kale's head begin to droop, he realized he would have to become a monster far worse than Varel to get them out alive. The air in the observation gallery grew thin, heavy with the metallic tang of the poisoned tea and the suffocating weight of betrayal. Through the two-way glass, Drajan watched as the neuroinhibitor took hold. Kale's small frame sagged, his eyelids drooping like leaden shutters, yet his hands remained white-knuckled, gripping the edges of his wooden chair. Varel loomed over him, a crimson shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the nursery. "The rhyme, Kale," she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to the boy's sluggish movements. "Sing it, and the sleep will be kind. Refuse, and I'll let the frequency tear your mind apart." Drajan's fingers dug into the cold stone of the inner wall, his knuckles cracking in the silence. He was a man who had built his life on the visible, territory, ledgers, and the cold steel of a handgun. But here, in the heart of his sanctuary, the most vital battle was being fought in the invisible space between a woman's cruelty and a boy's will. Suddenly, Kale's head rolled back. His gaze, glassy and unfocused from the drug, drifted away from Varel. It wandered across the colorful playhouse, past the scattered blocks, and settled directly on the dark, recessed vent where Drajan stood paralyzed. For a heartbeat, the world stopped breathing. There was no doubt. In that hazy, drug-induced state, the boy's ancestral intuition, the same blood code that made him a target, had sensed the presence of the only protector he had left. Kale's wide, amber eyes locked onto the darkness behind the grate. A spark of recognition flared in the depths of his pupils, piercing through the fog of the sedative. Drajan felt a jolt of electricity surge through his chest. He expected the boy to scream, to cry out for Uncle Drajan, to save him from the woman in red, to break the silence and bring the walls of the penthouse crashing down. One word from Kale would have alerted the guards in the hallway, triggering the gas, the lockdown, and Drazian's certain execution. But Kale did something that broke Drazian's soul more than any betrayal could. The boy's lips trembled, a sob catching in his throat, but he clamped his mouth shut. He didn't blink. He didn't point. Instead, he gave the smallest, most infinitesimal shake of his head, a silent plea for Drazian to stay hidden. Even in his terror, even with his mind being pried open by chemicals and sound, the child was protecting the man who had failed to protect him. Kale knew that if he acknowledged Drazian, the monsters in the hallway would come for the only person who might still be able to get them out alive. "What are you looking at?" Varel snapped, spinning around to follow the boy's gaze. Drazian drew back into the deepest corner of the gallery, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. Beside him, Lina held her breath, her eyes closed in a silent prayer. Varel stared at the vent for an eternity, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Just a vent," she muttered, turning back to Kale and grabbing him by the shoulders. "Focus, you little brat." The rhyme. Now, Kale let out a soft, choked whimper, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. He looked back at the floor, his small shoulders heaving as he intentionally drew Varel's aggression back toward himself, away from the shadow in the wall. Drazian watched the boy suffer, the weight of his own arrogance finally crushing him. He had called himself a king, a sovereign who ruled a city, yet he was being outmaneuvered and encouraged by a child who hadn't even reached his 10th year. As Kale began to whisper the first broken lines of a song he was desperately trying to sabotage, Drazian's anger changed. It was no longer a hot, impulsive fire. It was a cold, absolute promise of annihilation. He looked at Lina, his eyes reflecting the sharp, jagged edge of a man who was ready to burn everything he owned just to earn the right to look that boy in the eye again. The air in the observation gallery felt like it was ionizing, charged by Drazian's silent, white-hot fury. He watched Kale's small chest heave as the boy fought to keep the rhyme behind his teeth, a tiny soldier holding a line that men 3 times his size had abandoned. Drazian's gaze shifted to Lina. She didn't need to be told that the time for watching was over. She beckoned him with a sharp, clinical tilt of her head, leading him out of the narrow gallery and back into the darkened service corridor. They moved like ghosts through the guts of the penthouse, bypassing the primary hallways where the traitorous guards stood in their charcoal gray suits. Every step Drazian took was a calculated strike against the floor, his slicked back hair catching the dim glow of the emergency lights. He was a predator in a cage he had built himself, and the realization was a bitter pill. They reached the kitchen, a sprawling expanse of stainless steel and cold white marble that usually smelled of expensive espresso and sanitized surfaces. Lina didn't stop at the pantry. She knelt before the heavy, industrial-grade refrigerator, sliding a thin, silver shim into a seam that appeared invisible to the naked eye. With a soft, hydraulic hiss, a floor-to-ceiling spice rack didn't just open. It pivoted on a reinforced steel axis. Drazian's breath hitched. Behind the facade of domestic order was a tactical sanctuary. One wall was covered in a mosaic of digital monitors, each flickering with low-light feeds from rooms Drazian didn't even know were wired. But it was the other side that stopped his heart. Neatly arranged on magnetic racks were weapons that hadn't come from his armory. Compact submachine guns with integrated suppressors, ceramic blades that wouldn't trip a metal detector, and flashbang canisters marked with symbols from an intelligence agency he hadn't crossed paths with in a decade. "You've been busy, Lina," Drazian rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He reached out, his hand hovering over a modified Glock. "This isn't the kit of a housekeeper." "I told you, Drazian. I've been watching her for 3 months, she said, her voice steady as she began to pull high-velocity magazines from a hidden drawer. "While you were at the docks, I was planting these. While you were at your board meetings, I was recording every frequency Varel emitted. I knew your security was compromised the moment Elias started taking private meetings in the garage. I couldn't go to the police, and I couldn't go to you. Not until I had proof you wouldn't dismiss as jealousy." She handed him a tactical vest, thin enough to fit beneath his tailored suit jacket. Beneath the weapons is the evidence. Hard drives with every encrypted transmission Varel sent to the Sorn Syndicate. Every time she drugged Kale, every time she whispered those threats. "It's all here." Drajan took the vest, his fingers grazing the cold, ballistic fabric. He looked at the monitors, seeing Varel through a different lens now, a high-resolution thermal feed that highlighted the coldness of her heart. On another screen, he saw his loyal guards, Marco and Elias, laughing as they checked their weapons in the hall. "You've been fighting this war alone in my own house," Drajan said, his eyes meeting Lioness. The suspicion that had defined his life was being replaced by a grim, shared purpose. "I wasn't fighting for you," Lioness said, her gaze hardening. "I was fighting for Kale. But tonight, our interests finally align." She handed him a heavy, encrypted comms unit. "The Sorn extraction team is 4 minutes out. They're coming up the service elevator. If we don't move now, we don't move at all." Drajan checked his Beretta, then swapped it for the suppressed weapon on the rack. He felt the weight of the Maid's arsenal against his chest, a collection of secrets and steel that offered the only path to redemption. He wasn't just a boss returning to a broken home anymore. He was a man rearming for a revolution. He looked at the kitchen door, his jaw set in a line of absolute destruction. The silent house was about to become a battlefield. The hum of the high-tech kitchen was suddenly punctured by the sharp, rhythmic vibration of a phone against a marble countertop in the distance. Through the thermal feed on Lioness' tablet, Drajan watched Varel straighten her crimson blazer, stepping away from the trembling boy to answer the call. The audio cracked to life through the hidden comms link Lina had established. "Is it done?" Varel's voice was no longer the honeyed trap she used on Drajan. It was a cold, administrative rasp. "The dockside perimeter is secure," a familiar, gravelly voice replied. Drajan's heart didn't just drop, it turned to lead. The voice belonged to Silas, his second-in-command, the man who had sat at his right hand for 15 years. Silas had been the one to carry Kale into the penthouse the night the boy was orphaned. He was the man Drajan trusted with the keys to the kingdom. "And Valtor?" Varel asked, her eyes tracking Kale, who was still trying to scrub the metallic taste of the poisoned tea from his tongue. "The decoy meeting was a success," Silas said, and Drajan could almost see the traitor's calculated smirk through the speakers. "He's currently being led to the lower level of Warehouse 4. My men have orders to dispose of him the moment he steps out of the car. There won't be enough left of him to fill a casket, Varel. By 1 a.m., the Valtor name will be a footnote in the Sorn Syndicate's history." Drajan leaned against the cold steel of the hidden armory, the suppressed submachine gun heavy in his hands. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just a breach of contract. It was a liquidation of his entire existence. Silas wasn't just working with Varel. He was the architect of the vacuum Drajan had stepped into. "Good," Varel said, a predatory smile finally touching her lips. "The boy is close to breaking. The neuroinhibitors are doing their work. Once the encryption rhyme is logged, I'll initiate the ghost protocol and wipe the bank accounts. We don't need Drajan's signature for a dead man's assets." "The extraction team is in the service elevator now," Silas added. "They have orders to clean up the penthouse once you have the code. That includes the help. Make sure the maid is handled quietly. She's been far too observant lately." Varel glanced toward the kitchen door, her eyes narrowed. "Consider it done. I'll meet you at the extraction point in 20 minutes. Make sure the city's power grid is ready for the blackout signal." The call disconnected with a final, clinical beep. Drajan looked at Lina. Her face was pale, but her hands remained steady as she checked the charge on a ceramic blade. She had just heard her own death sentence pronounced by a man she barely knew, yet she didn't flinch. This sovereign of the city felt the last vestiges of his ego crumble. He had built his world on the loyalty of men like Silas, believing that fear was a stronger bond than blood. He had been a fool. The silence of the penthouse wasn't a sign of his power. It was the silence of a grave being dug around him. "They think I'm dead," Drajan whispered, the sound vibrating in his chest like a muffled explosion. His eyes moved to the monitor, where Kale had curled into a ball on the rug, weeping silently. "Let them keep thinking it," Lina replied, handing him a pair of tactical headsets. "Silas thinks he's disposing of a boss. He hasn't realized yet that he's just cleared the way for a ghost." Drajan tightened the strap of his vest, the weight of the betrayal fueling a cold, focused clarity. He wasn't going to Warehouse 4. He was already home. And if Silas and Varel wanted to burn his legacy to the ground, he would make sure they were standing in the center of the fire when it started. The breach of trust was absolute, but the reckoning would be legendary. He stepped toward the kitchen door, no longer a man seeking a home, but a wraith reclaiming a battlefield. The heavy double doors of the playroom didn't just open. They shattered inward under the force of Drajan's tactical boot. The sound was a thunderclap that tore through the artificial serenity of the high-rise. Drajan stepped into the golden light, the suppressed weapon in his hand a silent promise of death, his eyes locked on the woman in red. Varel didn't scream. She didn't reach for a gun. With a chilling, fluid motion, she stepped behind Kale, her hand clamping onto the boy's shoulder while her other thumb hovered over a small, glowing haptic trigger she had pulled from her blazer. "One more step, Drajan, and I vent the atmospheric tanks," she said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "This building is a sealed ecosystem. I've already bypassed the emergency overrides. I press this, and every lung in this penthouse, Kale's, the Maid's, and yours, is filled with pure nitrogen. You'll be unconscious in 30 seconds. Brain dead in 3 minutes." Drajan halted, his finger tightening on the trigger, his heart hammering against the tactical vest Lyanna had provided. He looked at Kale. The boy was pale, his eyes unfocused from the neuroinhibitor, yet he stared at Drajan with a haunting mix of terror and recognition. "You're a coward, Varel," Drajan rumbled, his voice vibrating with a lethal bass. "You can't win a war with a child as a shield." "I've already won the war, Drajan," she countered, her thumb twitching over the sensor. "Silas has already confirmed your disposal. You're a dead man walking through a ghost's house. The only thing left is the code. Give me the rhyme, or I turn this nursery into a vacuum." The standoff wasn't a gunfight. It was a psychological garrote. Drajan could feel the weight of the air in the room, suddenly conscious of every breath Kale took. He looked past Varel to the floor-to-ceiling glass, where the city skyline glowed like a distant, uncaring witness. He realized then that the playroom massacre wouldn't be measured in bullets, but in the oxygen they were all rapidly consuming. "The rhyme isn't yours to take," a voice drifted from the doorway. Lyanna stepped into the light, her face a mask of cold, professional defiance. She held the encrypted tablet high, the screen flickering with a rapid-fire sequence of red overrides. "I've spent 3 months inside your network, Varel. You think you're the only one who knows how to play with the life support?" Varel's eyes flickered toward the maid, a spark of genuine doubt entering her gaze. "You're a servant. You don't have the clearance." "I don't need clearance when I have the architect's back doors," Lyanna replied, her thumb hovering over her own screen. "If you trigger that gas, I trigger the external pressure release. The windows shatter. We might fall 30 stories, but Kale will have air. Will you?" The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Drajan watched the two women, the infiltrator and the protector, locked in a digital stalemate. He saw the sweat bead on Varel's forehead, the way her grip on Kale's shoulder tightened. "He's just a boy, Varel," Drajan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the room. "Look at him. He's not a code. He's not a key. He's a child you've spent months breaking. Is the Sorn Syndicate worth this?" For a microsecond, Varel hesitated. It was the only opening Drajan needed. He didn't fire his weapon. He lunged, his massive frame a blur of black and shadow, moving to put his own body between the boy and the woman who had turned their home into a kill box. The massacre was beginning, but it wasn't the air that was about to run out. It was Varel's time. The tension in the playroom shifted from a digital standoff to a raw, bleeding silence as Drajan stood between Kale and the woman who had sought to harvest his soul. Varel's thumb still hovered over the trigger, her face a mask of fractured ego, but her eyes were fixed on Lyanna. The air felt heavy, charged with a secret that was finally clawing its way to the surface. Drajan kept his weapon leveled at Varel, but his voice was a low, dangerous rumble directed at the woman standing in the doorway. "You've done more than watch, Lyanna. You've anticipated every move. No servant has this level of access. No stranger has this level of devotion." Lyanna stepped fully into the light, the cold, clinical mask of the housekeeper falling away to reveal a depth of grief and resolve that made Drajan's own scars feel shallow. She reached into the collar of her uniform and pulled out a delicate, tarnished silver locket hidden beneath the fabric. With a trembling hand, she clicked it open, revealing a microphoto of a woman holding a newborn, a woman whose eyes were an exact amber match to the terrified boy huddled on the rug. "I didn't infiltrate this house to serve you, Drajan," Lina said, her voice finally breaking its monotone restraint. "I came to reclaim what was stolen from me. I am not just his protector. I am his mother." Kale's breath hitched, his small hand reaching out toward the sound of her voice, the neuroinhibitors failing to suppress the instinctual pull of a bond that predated the blood code. Varel let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "The biological failure? You're the ghost who gave him up to the Sorn Syndicate's rivals. You're the reason he's a walking encryption key." "I gave him up to save him from your family," Lina spat, her eyes flashing with a maternal fire that eclipsed the neon glow of the city behind them. "I knew the Sorn Syndicate would weaponize his DNA before he could even walk. I hid him in the one place I thought was too dark for your light to reach, with a man whose reputation for violence would act as a natural deterrent. I took this job, I wore this uniform, and I scrubbed your floors for 3 years just to be near him, to ensure the code stayed buried in a nursery rhyme he'd never have to sing." Drajan felt the world shift on its axis. Every invisible moment he had ignored, the way Lina lingered by Kale's bed, the extra care she took with his favorite meals, the silent watch she kept while Drajan was away. It wasn't duty. It was a 3-year deep-cover operation fueled by a mother's desperation. "You used me," Drajan whispered, the realization cutting deeper than Silas's betrayal. "You turned my home into a bunker for your own war." "I used the only man capable of keeping a monster like Varel at bay," Lina countered, her gaze never wavering. "And I would do it again. But tonight, the secrets are over. The locket isn't just a memento, Drajan. It's the physical bypass. It contains the true mother code, the one that can override the biometric locks Varel is trying to force." Varel lunged forward, her finger pressing down on the haptic trigger in a final, spiteful act of destruction. "If I can't have the key, no one leaves this tower." But Lina was faster. She slammed the locket onto the tablet's interface, the silver contact points sparking as they merged with the digital architecture of the house. The high-pitched whine of the atmospheric vents suddenly reversed, a rush of fresh, cool air flooding the room as the lockdown seals hissed open. Drajan moved instinctively, scooping Kale into his arms, feeling the boy's small hands cling to his tactical vest. He looked at Lina, the woman who had played him as skillfully as any rival, but had done so to protect the only piece of innocence left in his world. The maid was gone. In her place stood a woman who had sacrificed her identity to be a shadow in her son's life. "The extraction team is in the hallway," Lina said, her voice regaining its tactical edge as she drew a ceramic blade. "They don't care about mothers or bosses. They only care about the code. If we're going to get Kale out, we have to finish this now." The air in the penthouse screamed with the sound of breaching charges. Drajan's tactical headset crackled with the cold, efficient voices of the Sorn extraction team as they flooded the hallway. He looked at Kale, whose amber eyes were finally beginning to clear of the chemical fog, then at Lina, who stood with her ceramic blade drawn, a mother ready to hold the line until her last heartbeat. Varel scrambled toward the master console, her fingers dancing over the keys. "If I can't have the boy, I'll take the city," she shrieked. "The upload is at 90%, Drajan. Your empire is already being dismantled, and once this completes, I'll trigger the penthouse self-destruct. You'll be a king of nothing but ash." Drajan looked at the massive server banks hummed behind a wall of reinforced glass, the digital brain of his entire life's work. Every ledger, every offshore account, every blackmail file that kept the city's elite under his thumb was housed in that silicon labyrinth. To destroy it was to commit financial suicide. To let it stand was to hand a monster the keys to a kingdom. He didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy, suppressed rifle toward the server cooling tanks. "Drajan, no." Varel screamed, lunging for him. "That's billions. You'll be a nobody." "I'd rather be a nobody with a soul," Drajan rumbled, his voice a low, terrifying growl of redemption. He pulled the trigger. The high-velocity rounds shattered the pressurized cooling lines. Liquid nitrogen sprayed across the overheating processors, followed by a series of cascading electrical explosions. The room filled with white mist and the smell of ozone. On the screens, the upload bar flickered, turned red, and vanished into a system failure loop. The Sorn Syndicate's Ghost Protocol didn't just stop. It imploded, taking Drajan's entire fortune with it. The servers are melting down. Lyanna shouted over the roar of the fire alarm. The backup generators are going to blow. We have to go now. Drajan scooped Kale into his arms, shielding the boy's head with his broad, tattooed chest. He grabbed Lyanna's hand, pulling her toward the kitchen's hidden service lift. Behind them, Varel stood paralyzed among the sparks and smoke, staring at the empty screens of the empire she had tried to steal. They plummeted down the service shaft just as the first major explosion rocked the top floor. The elevator doors jammed halfway on the ground level. Drajan used his massive shoulders to heave the steel open, stepping out into the cool night air of the back alley. Above them, the crown of the high-rise was a crown of flame. The floor-to-ceiling glass he had once used to survey his subjects was raining down in a million glittering shards, reflecting the fire like 1,000 dying stars. Everything Drajan Valtor had built, the power, the fear, the gold watch on his wrist, was melting into the Chicago skyline. Lyanna stopped in the shadows of a brick wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Kale, then at Drajan. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't look like a maid, and he didn't look like a boss. They were just 3 survivors in the dark. Kale reached out, his small hand finding Drajan's jaw, tracing the line of his clenched teeth. "Uncle Drajan," he whispered. "Is it over?" Drajan looked up at the burning tower, then back at the boy. He felt a strange, terrifying lightness in his chest, the weight of the crown replaced by the weight of a life. He took a deep breath of the soot-stained air. "It's over, Kale," Drajan said, his voice soft but absolute. "The king is dead." He looked at Lyanna, and for the first time, a genuine, tired smile touched his lips. He reached out and draped his charred suit jacket over her shoulders. They moved together into the deep shadows of the city, leaving the fire behind. Drajan Valtor had lost his kingdom, but as he walked into the night with the boy in his arms and the woman who had saved them both at his side, he realized he had finally found his home. In a world where we often measure success by the height of our empires and the weight of our influence, this story serves as a visceral reminder that the most dangerous blind spot is the one within our own 4 walls. Drajan Valtor was a man who owned the skyline, but was a stranger in his own sanctuary. He traded his presence for power, only to realize that while he was out conquering the world, a predator was dismantling the only legacy that truly mattered. The insightful lesson here is that our children do not need us to build them kingdoms. They need us to be their shield. Negligence isn't just an absence of care. It's an invitation for darkness to take root. True sovereignty isn't about being feared by your enemies. It's about being the person your loved ones can trust without a single word being spoken. To those of you feeling the weight of the daily grind, remember, no fortune is worth the price of a child's peace. May you have the courage to listen to the whispers of the housekeepers in your life, those quiet voices of truth, before the silence becomes a scream. Invest in presence, for at the end of the day, a home built on love is the only fortress that never falls. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Drajan's journey. Your incredible support and engagement allow these stories of redemption and sacrifice to come to life. If Kale's courage or Lyanna's devotion touched your heart today, please subscribe and share this video with someone you love. We truly appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you in the next chapter.